So welcome everybody to this edition of JFK Live, and we have a special guest, Christopher Tidmore, who I met a couple weeks ago when he gave me a tour, a JFK tour of New Orleans, and I found it so interesting that I thought we got to have this guy on the show and share a little bit what he knows. So Christopher is a historian, political podcaster, journalist, tour guide. He wears many different hats. But I think for our purposes, he's on the board of directors of the Louisiana State Museum. So he's a historian. He's a guardian of New Orleans' famous cemeteries and preserving them. He runs strangetours.com. And if you want a tour of New Orleans, a JFK tour of New Orleans, and maybe some other kind of tour of New Orleans, he can probably give it to you. So I highly recommend it. And he also has the Garden District Bookshop in New Orleans. So this is a guy who knows New Orleans. So welcome, Christopher. And, let's just dive right into it. When I took your tour, I knew, the story of JFK, the JFK story as it concerns New Orleans. And I thought I knew a lot, and yet I learned a lot in the, a couple hours where we talked and showed me around downtown New Orleans. So first of all, welcome.
Thank you. And I have to say, Jeff, it was when Jeff wanted to do the tour, and I was like, you want me to tell you about the JFK assassination, the guru. And I was very careful to say that what I can speak of is the people who I knew or knew people who did, who are key players in the New Orleans side of the story. So while I have written quite a bit on the assassination, and I have been interviewed by CBS and a few others, I don't claim to have every piece of detail that every person on this podcast does, but I might be able to put a little light on the New Orleans element of the story, and particularly the proximity these people had to one another, which is not always appreciated.
Yeah. So let's start out with, some of these characters whom you knew or knew of, and certainly knew the milieu in which they came from. So at the heart of the New Orleans story, thanks to Oliver Stone and Jim Garrison, is the figure of Clay Shaw. So quite apart from the JFK story, who was Clay Shaw in the life of New Orleans in the early 1960s?
He was a critical figure. He was the person that brought the business community, the diplomatic community, which was still very valid at the time, and the social communities together. He was a highly, deeply respected figure, which a lot of the dramatizations, particularly the rather bad Oliver Stone one, don't really portray very well. And Jeff, when I took the tour with you, one of the first things I did was we left your hotel. I pointed to the World Trade Center, originally the International Trademark, and it said, well, the first to understand Clay Shaw is that when in 1960, you would not, as a New Orleanian, really be able to look upon the river. There were wharfs all the way down for 100 miles in either direction. He said he was the first person to reopen the river and create a building that would house 57 embassies and consulates, really, as well as the business and economic community and the first convention center. And so it's in the context of someone who crossed so many social and economic and political realms that the accusation comes. And part of the reason why it was so unbelievable to New Orleanians, because he was such a respected figure in so many different worlds in New Orleans.
Yet, and that at the same time, we know that Clay Shaw was a highly paid contract CIA agent. And with those sorts of contacts, he would have been valuable to a CIA. Yeah. So, which is not to say that he was involved in JFK's assassination, but you're talking about the sense of shock when Garrison would indict him. This was not just any old businessman. This
is. So let me tell you guys a story you may not know. And it's a deeply personal story. But my father-in-law's father was a prominent attorney by the name of Nigel Rafferty. He was a maritime attorney. He was very much involved with Clay Shaw on a lot of things. They weren't close friends. They just knew each other professionally. His closest friend in the world was Jim Garrison. They had been law school roommates at Tulane. They were best friends. And every possible words. When one night Jim calls Nigel and says, "I need to talk to you." It was about 9 o'clock at night. And he says, "Okay." I mean, who died? It's just like, what tomorrow? He says, "I got to come by." So he comes by his house in the Garden District of New Orleans on Connery Street, knocks on the door, and he says, "I got to go." So they go into Nigel's study, and he says, "I think, I think the president, there was a conspiracy to assassinate the president." This is after the JFK assassination. And he said, and he begins to tell the story, and he says, "Clay Shaw." And Nigel says, "Okay, start from the beginning and go through it." He went through it like a litigator. And he walks out and tells his wife, Marjorie Bruce Rafferty, known as Brucey, who'd known Jim for as long as Nigel had. He says, "I think Jim's finally lost his mind." And he's saying this about his best friend, who he wants to protect. So that gives you kind of a mental conception of how surrealistic this may have seemed to the average person. However, when you look below the surface, you start saying, wait, a few things don't add up. And that's part of the story I told you, Jeff.
Yeah. So, so Shaw is a civic leader of sorts.
He is essentially simultaneously, he found something called the International Trademark. He is the director of the International Club. International Club is an association of pretty much every consul, every maritime business. He is the tribune, if you will, for the Port of New Orleans, which at the time is still the largest port in North America. And in point of fact, most people don't realize this. If you factor every port facility from the mouth of the Mississippi River to Baton Rouge, we're still the largest port in America. But at the time, it's disproportionately. It's larger than the Port of Long Beach. It's large. It's almost just the size of the Port of New York. He is someone who is opening the river to non-maritime commerce, to actually reoccupy it as a space for the average New Orleanian. He's one of the organizers of the original founding of the Chamber of Commerce here. He creates the first convention center. He is a liaison and helps create, and this is a New Orleans thing, some of the newest Mardi Gras crews, which is not an insignificant thing in this city. He plays many different roles. And yes, he's a bachelor, but he's not someone who the average person would have associated as being even gay, though he was privately. They're not. This is somebody who's very much part of the civic world and multiple civic worlds. This is the guy, if you will.
So let's talk about some other characters. When we did the tour, we walked up Canal Street to the corner where Oswald is handing out pamphlets and gets arrested and comes to the attention of the New Orleans news media. Who else is looking in on that corner on where Oswald is doing this in the summer of 1963?
So, if you will indulge me in a little walk down memory lane, folks, I will tell you how I came to the story. At the age of 24, I'm a young journalist, and I decide to do a story on a radio station that had been taken over. I'm hustling for young stories as a beat reporter, and I meet a man by the name of Ed Butler. Ed Butler calls me and my then writing partner Jeff Carrere. He says, "Come interview me, find out about this talk radio station." And so, what was supposed to be a 30-minute interview tends to be a 2.5-hour conversation with he and his closest friend, Haywood Hillier, who also plays a role in the story. And at the end of it, he offers me a radio show. I didn't know who Ed Butler was from Adam. Of course, anyone who knows the JFK stories, Ed made his fame by seeing a one Lee Harvey Oswald on the corner of Canal and what's called Exchange Alley, passing out hands off Cuba things, and he invites him to go on WGSO radio, and a half-hour conversation is recorded. A little over a month later, after the assassination, it becomes clear that it leads to the media that, oh my God, we have this interview with this guy that assassinated him, and it becomes international news. It makes Ed's career, and Portrait in Red, and many recordings later. It comes in. So when I'm working for Ed Butler, this is the end of the 1999, 2000, and I'm beginning to realize who it was I was talking to. And it started a long interest in the players of the assassination because I vaguely knew of these people. Some of the players I literally knew, William Riley and others. Others, like Clay Shaw. Clay Shaw had been a very close friend of my grandmother's. Was a stalwart at her parties and was their circle of friends. Jim Garrison, as we can tell, wasn't just for my in-laws, was well known and was a contemporary of my grandfather's, and they were friends. And so I began to interest that. And as I began to study, some things didn't make sense. One of my mentors in life was a man by the name of Dr. Alton Ochsner Jr. His father, Alton Ochsner, founded the Ochsner Clinic. Alton Ochsner Jr., I met in the 1980s for the first time as something called the Caribbean Commission, which was outfitting and helping the Nicaraguan Contras. And so the anti-communism was in the blood of this organization. Others, wonderful gentlemen, were very much involved. Ed was very much involved, his Informational Council of the Americas. All these people had a long record of anti-communism activities. So it wasn't so surprising when Ed told me the story of how he actually saw Lee Harvey Oswald in that corner. And the way he saw it is catacornered from Exchange Alley. Exchange Place, as it's formerly known, was originally the place where all the cotton and sugar exchanges were for New Orleans. They led to the St. Louis Exchange Hotel, which in the 19th century was the largest commodities exchange in the world. And I mean commodities in every sense of the word: sugar, cotton, European goods, human beings. It was the largest slave market in the world as well. A destruction of a piece of it is the reason the French Quarter was preserved, because people were so horrified that that such a historical place away created the first district that was protected by law. So when Lee Oswald's passing out these things, right across from it is one of the most famous men's clubs in New Orleans. New Orleans is has 5 very prominent clubs, each of them associated with a Mardi Gras crew, but it's really where all the civic and personal business happens. To be a member of these clubs, it's very similar to the English club system. And there is one club directly across, one of the most influential, called the Pickwick Club. Both Ed and Dr. Ochsner were members of the Pickwick Club. Dr. Ochsner had invited Ed to lunch one day, just a regular lunch. Dr. Ochsner was one of Ed's big benefactors for the Informational Council of the Americas, Inca. They were having lunch. They come out right when Lee Harvey Oswald is yelling, "Hands off Cuba." Coincidence? Perhaps. Except, where is Lee Harvey Oswald specifically? He is 100 feet away from his uncle's bar. His uncle, the bar, is a Marcello family property. His uncle had run numbers for Carlos Marcello for years, and he's literally passing out pro-communist things on a mob-owned street, for all intents and purposes, in front of his own family's bar. We could put his own family in danger, and he does it at a time across from the most prominent club in town, where just so happens the most actively vocal anti-communist on the air is coming out of lunch.
Right.
Could be coincidence, could also not be, as we'll explore in the story.
Welcome comments and questions from people. Raise your hand in the chat. If you look at the bottom, you see the heart-shaped icon that says react. You can raise your hand and ask or give a comment to Christopher. So here's Oswald, in this New Orleans milieu. He's calling attention to himself, certainly, right? I mean, these are provocative actions. So you mentioned William Riley. Who's he? Explain that part of the story as well.
So people think of New Orleans, they think of jazz, they think of Bourbon Street. They forget that even to this day, 80% of the coffee that comes into North America comes through New Orleans and is mostly processed here. If you ever drink Folgers coffee, if you want bad coffee, but it's Folgers coffee, it's almost always processed in New Orleans. And there are several coffee barons in New Orleans, the Westfelds and others. The most prominent of all of them is the Riley family. They still are prominent in the coffee business. And William Riley was the most active vocal anti-communist in the business community. He's actively, this is not a question of conspiracies. It's a well-known historical fact. He was one of the prime funders of the Bay of Pigs invasion. He was very close to the Cuban revolutionaries, and a lot of the planning for overthrowing Castro that would ultimately come in Bay of Pigs is being organized by him or at one of his buildings or one of his arcades. Just to understand the geography, you think of Miami as the place where the Cubans are. The Cuban upper class had always lived in New Orleans. New Orleans it was the closest for a boat called the Smoky Mary, and most of them were born at a hospital in New Orleans. It's called Ochsner Hospital to get American citizenship. All of these things are connected, and William Riley plays this role. His office in the Central Business District of New Orleans, by the way, is adjacent to where the CIA had one of its offices. It's across from from Hale Boggs, who of course was head of House Un-American Activities, a congressman, and it's right next to the FBI field office. Oh, and just to add this, Lee Oswald worked as a security guard in the building next door to the Riley Coffee Company.
Yeah. So one thing Christopher's tour really brought home to me was, and this is 3-4 blocks from where Oswald's handing out the pamphlets,
Yeah,
and from where the Pickwick Club is. All of this is, and where the newspapers are. So this is all happening in very close proximity. Another person we talked about who you knew, David Ferry, who figures in Garrison's investigation, dies actually in the middle of Garrison's investigation. Who was David Ferry?
So let me be fair. I didn't know David Ferry personally. I knew a lot of people who knew him very well. So there's one degree of separation, not 3 or 4. David Ferry is a pilot, and he is a player in all of this. If you were to look at the Oliver Stone movie, in some accounts, he's this wildly flamboyant. So it's every person I have talked to, many of whom I've known my entire life, who knew David Ferry very well, said the exact opposite. He was always meticulously dressed. He was always incredibly polite. He was cordial, very well educated. And he is the connection between various groups. He is a pilot. There is compelling evidence he was a CIA pilot, but he also is someone who ran in many of the, in sort of he's not at the same social level as Clay Shaw and all this, but he's not some underworld figure at all. He is sort of a courier between some of these different people. He's an active employee at one point of the Rileys. He works and he has connections with all of these people at any given time. And he was respected. He was the way in the 1960s, pilots, he even flew for Delta briefly. Pilots have a higher level of status than they even have today. You know, if you ever watch the TV show Pan Am, you get the idea of how it was. Yeah. So,
right. Other people, who was Garrison in the political constellation of New Orleans? Was his prosecution of a JFK case out of the blue? Was that startling? And what was the reaction of the local political establishment, if you will?
all right. The reaction of the local political establishment is that Jim Garrison has lost his mind. The simple way of explaining Jim Garrison is he's a political reformer. He is elected district attorney over a previous, sort of the old political machine. He is considered one of the young reformers. He comes out of a post-war reform movement in New Orleans, founded by a man named Chet Morrison. He's not elected at the same time as Chet Morrison was mayor of New Orleans. Chet Morrison, for those who want to understand the story, was JFK's ambassador to the Organization of American States. He is someone who has a lot of very positive credentials from people, and he's also someone who's trying to reform the office. The district attorney, this is a time when Louisiana politics has always been a little corrupt compared to the rest of the nation. I like to say it's not more corrupt. It's just there's a higher tolerance for corruption. Jim Garrison didn't have it. He actually was considered a really clean light, and he was going after some prominent politicians. So when this came about, people were a little shocked because it was sort of outside of what he was aiming on, which was trying to, was police brutality, but also trying to clean up the streets at the same time. It was such a national story that allowed some people to give him the benefit of the doubt. He was somebody who had seemed like a pretty straight shooter. And but it was an incredibly, when Clay Shaw comes into this, it's an incredibly controversial moment that's ripping New Orleans society asunder.
Mm-hmm. And in the middle of all this milieu, you also have Carlos Marcello. One thing that I thought was interesting about our talk was you pointed out not just that organized crime was disrupted by the Cuban Revolution, which was, to be sure, a big economic sector, but the international trade of New Orleans and Cuba was way bigger than organized. The legitimate trade, the legitimate business was way bigger than the organized crime business. So the shock to the system of the Cuban Revolution, while it was huge to organized crime, was also very substantial to the economic lifeblood of New Orleans, no?
So not only are we dealing with sugar, which is has been New Orleans' raison d'etre as a product since the 19th century, since really the 18th century. Sugar importation, sugar transport. Sugar is the reason why the South was called Dixie, because New Orleans was so rich on the sugar trade. We started printing $10 notes or 10 notes, and nobody could say the French word for 10, so they called them Dixies. Sugar is a large portion of the economy. Then you take after sugar, you get tobacco. Where are almost all the cigar factories at the time? Where are almost cigarettes and imports? My own great-grandfather was a man by the name of Macrino Trellis. He had the El Trellis Cigar Company. El Trellis Cigar Companies imported from 6 different plantations that actually were family relations. My great-grandmother's family, the Ventas, in Cuba. It was the major cigar, one of these top 6 cigar companies in the United States. Intertrade, international trade that would stop through Cuba and come to the port of New Orleans, where a direct shot between it. You had Cuban families living in New Orleans with property in Cuba and vice versa. And so you've got, in today's dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in cross-border trade, cross-border elements, to the point where Cuba is effectively a colony of not just the United States, but New Orleans. And then to take a step further, you have the casinos and transit money. And Carlos Marcello, he's born in Tunisia. He comes to as a boy with his parents. Actually, have to change their name to Marcello because the workmen, they go to work at what's called the Elmwood Plantation, which he would later own. And they already had their name, so they changed it to Marcello. And eventually that plantation would be one of his casinos here in New Orleans. But Carlos Marcello becomes an expert at essentially organized crime arbitrage of getting goods and services through. And he works and it becomes dominant a player in the importation of things from Cuba and Central America. Not just Cuba, but Cuba is a huge part of his portfolio. And when the casinos start going there, he becomes a major player for Meyer Lansky's investment schemes. But the thing that I like to explain to everybody about New Orleans that no one seems to catch is also geography. So if you walk a block and a half from where we were at the Riley Company, what are you standing in front of? The United Fruit Company, Sam Zemurray and his company. So everybody's like, oh, this stuff couldn't have happened. Let me get this straight. A group of New Orleanians couldn't overthrow a regime in a Latin American state because that never happened. Oh, except when it happened with Sam Zemurray and many of these same players in Guatemala, Honduras, so on and so forth, in the same 20-block radius of New Orleans and planning. And so when I try to explain this was the entrepot to Latin American trade. And when a huge portion, the largest portion of it was cut off, obviously the business community of New Orleans is motivated and they're willing to cut deals to get the trade back however they could. We're in what is billions of dollars of agricultural imports that are coming through the city.
So, So when you describe this counter-revolutionary milieu, and not only on the street level where people are talking about Castro, but at the economic level, the commanding heights of the economy, people are mobilized against the Cuban regime and taking action to ensure its downfall. And this is all happening in the summer of 1963. So then this fellow Oswald, wanders through. What do you make of Oswald? And I'm not saying you're an expert in him, but you're an expert in the milieu that he walked into. Who was he? What's your impressions of him?
I find it harder and harder to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald, he never actually liked to be called Harvey, it was Lee Oswald, was the person that everyone says he was. And many of you on this call know his sojourns in the Soviet Union and others better than I. I know I've talked to enough people to do it, but I can tell you this. He's a kid who grows up in uptown New Orleans. He is the nephew of a Marcello family, basically bookie. It was numbers running that his uncle did. His family is very much, he's a quarter rat, which is a joke for a kid who grows up in the quarter. He's, by the age of 12, he's doing minor errands for Carlos Marcello and his group. So he's already doing work for them. He is working by the time that all of these events have happened as a security guard in a building that is not only adjacent to the Riley coffee company, it's connected through a parking lot, and he's regularly walking across it in the parking lot into the Riley's building. And he's doing this all in the face, right in front of Marcello family properties, in the midst of a counter-revolutionary atmosphere where the people that are owning the buildings that he's walking around and pushing it are actively funding the creation of an army, or have been and have spent this. What passing out hands-off Cuba things in New Orleans at that point in time was as close to suicidal as you could get.
Right.
Yeah. It would have made. I don't care. You would have had to be a brave person in this city at the time to do that. And yet he does it unmolested.
Yeah. Let me ask a couple of questions from the audience. First, from Janet Bannister, who's the niece of Guy Bannister.
Oh, really?
And she has a podcast about Guy Bannister, and she's asking if you know any information about the relationship between David Ferrie and Guy Bannister.
Not as much as I would like, honestly. I've heard several different things about their relationship, and obviously Guy Bannister is playing. I can't quantify them as a historian. It's their secondhand kind of hearsay. There's no doubt that Guy Bannister is talking to all of these people on a regular basis. He's geographically located in the middle of this, but I don't have the personal accounts of that well enough to speak as an expert. Most of mine are much second and third degree counts, and I try not to comment too much on that, except to say that Guy Bannister is a player in all of this, and everybody knew it at the time.
Another question from Larry Schnapp. The story that Garrison was soft on Marcello or ignored him or wasn't the crusading reformer against him. Do you have any thoughts about that? I've heard that before. I don't have an opinion one way or the other.
And John Davis, by the way, thought that Garrison used to go to Las Vegas on Marcello's nickel, or at least have some privileges at one of their hotels.
I don't know, but here is where geography plays a much more important role. Carlos Marcello did not operate gambling operations in Orleans Parish. So New Orleans is a city of multiple counties. We call them parishes. And Carlos Marcello was very careful to pretty much keep almost all of his operations in New Orleans either legal or semi-legal in Orleans. However, If you just went over an invisible line into Jefferson Parish, you went to the Elmwood casinos, to all of his different places, all of it in no more than a 10 to 15-minute drive. The reason why I discount a lot of that, besides the fact of the number of people I know who knew Garrison really well and said, yeah, that's not Jim, is the fact that Carlos Marcello very clearly had the sheriff of Jefferson Parish in his pocket. I mean, it was on his payroll. And so there wasn't much need to go after the district attorney, because there wasn't activities that would have been in Garrison's jurisdiction to a great degree. The stuff that Carlos Marcello owned in the French Quarter was mostly legacy stuff. For those that also don't know this, the French Quarter of New Orleans, by 1896, the most common language on the streets of the French Quarter is going to be Sicilian Italian. It's referred to as Little Palermo. And so a lot of what he owned in the French Quarter was stuff that he just owned for years, and he had a romantic attachment. It's his home. There are a lot of Italian families still living there. My grandfather was growing up literally down the street from Carlos Marcello at the same time, on Esplanade and Rampart Street. So they're growing up in the same community. And so one of the things that's happening is Garrison doesn't have the legal justification to go after Carlos Marcello as the district attorney of the county that he's in. There's plenty to go after Carlos Marcello about, but it's on the adjoining county or the state or the national level. And to say that Carlos Marcello owned and ran in Jefferson Parish, the way I explain the story today is I'm very well acquainted with his grandson Michael, and they donated about 10 years ago 100 acres to the Jefferson Parish Economic Development Authority to build the foremost magnet school in New Orleans and the actual economic development economic park that's there. They still owned it. They called it Churchill Dads. And so this is a decade ago, and they're still major business players, mostly legitimate to this day, in Jefferson Parish. And that just gives you a small little glimpse. Nobody blinked hard about it. They were like, sure, why not? It was like...
Another question from a reader, Douglas. There's the story of Clay Shaw and David Ferry being seen in Clinton on the voter registration drive in the summer of '63. Do you know
the Donaldsonville trip? All right, this gets into it. It is the one piece of and I know there was another question about Dr. Mary Sherman and that whole story. It's the one piece of evidence that Ed Haslam uses that kind of quantify, were they on this trip? Before, in the days before you had interstates in Louisiana, there were two ways to go north, and one of them is called LA1. It's a 2-lane road, and it goes through Donaldsonville and up the west bank of Mississippi. And the story is there was a voter registration drive on that day, and Lee, being a supporter of equal access, goes and registers to vote. And they have Lee H. Oswald is on the record. And so it's if you follow it, the reason why they're in the car is not explained unless you go into the story of why did all of these people know each other, and that gets and it goes beyond communism. It goes to a story about about a CIA project at the Tulane School of Tropical Medicine, and that they were on the thought process was they were on their way to the Angola State Prison to find essentially test subjects for this. I don't have evidence to say whether that happened. I do, however, having interviewed Ed Haslam on my radio show and all this, and know him, and had him in the bookstore and the whole works, I can honestly say I've seen the evidence of the voter records, and it's very blunt. Lee H. Oswald is there. It looks like Oswald's handwriting, and it's a glaring piece of evidence. So
yeah. And so do you think Shaw and Ferry were there with him? Are those reports credible?
There are people who say they were. I have not witnessed, I do not have somebody who directly witnessed them together, with one possible exception. Judith Vary Baker said she saw them together, and that story, of course, gets a very elaborate. And And there's questions about that story, but I will tell you that it would make sense if you follow the logic that Lee Harvey. So Lee is working as a security guard in a building that is the same complex as the Riley Coffee Company and the CIA office. And the idea is that it was a cover. And Clay Shaw is a CIA asset. That's very clear. So were a lot of people in New Orleans at the time. This is remember, New Orleans was a place that the CIA actively recruited from because of our Latin American connections and all this. And David Ferrie was a front. It makes sense if you follow that logic. The three of them would know each other very well. They're all in. There's so many occasions where they're all in the same place that it makes sense they would go up there. And if you follow, and if you believe that there is a bigger reason why all this is happening, not just the assassination, but this CIA project, it makes sense that they would need the test subjects at that point in time that they did. I can't speak to that except to say that I know a few people who claim they were involved, but I also know people who would say the last thing Dr. Alton Ochsner would have done senior is violate his Hippocratic oath for a weapons program. So, I can't quantify that.
Bill Simpich asks about Ochsner as a business leader of the anti-communist movement, and his anti-Castro political connections. How important was he in that milieu?
Unbelievably so. So one of my mentors was his son, Dr. Alton Ochsner Jr., who was very active in the anti-communist movement in the 1980s and 90s. I was very, very close to he and his wife, Barbara. And I heard a lot of firsthand stories about his father, and then later working for Ed Butler about Dr. Ochsner. Dr. Ochsner is playing three roles. He is one of the prime funders for not just things that are happening in New Orleans. He remains remains one of the main funders for the Informational Council of America's, Ed Butler's anti-communist organization, for decades. He is he's not just a doctor. He builds one of the most influential hospitals in the United States, if not the world. He is the place that every mother from Latin America with money is going to come and have their kids so they can get American citizenship. He's building one of the first cancer clinics. It is as a research hospital as part of Tulane University. He's a professor. He is an incredibly well-respected figure. One of my favorite stories about Alton Ochsner was he was Rex, the king of carnival. And if those don't know, this is the highest honor you can have in New Orleans, and it's an incredibly grueling day, and usually a party after. It's 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. Alton Ochsner was in surgery at 7 a.m. the next morning. That's how meticulous, what kind of work ethic he had, which anybody who's ever done it would look at you like you just lost your mind. But he did it very successfully. He was an unbelievably respected source. He was also, actually, interestingly, for those to say, one of the first doctors in America to be very vocal and against smoking, and was very outspoken. Published 2 books on it about the dangers of tobacco and cancer at a time when everyone's with. My grandfather, who's friends with Alton Ochsner, one time he said Aki had us come to this thing at the Roosevelt Hotel, and it was a whole lecture on the dangers of smoking. And he and Dr. Ochsner walk out, and everybody lights up, and they're the only 2 people who aren't smoking after an entire hour lecture on how smoking will kill you. So kind of,
Yeah. One name that comes up in connection with Alton Ochsner is Mary Sherman, the cancer researcher. And Dr. Mary's monkey presents a very provocative picture of that. Any thoughts about that? Do you know anything about Mary Sherman?
Yes, Mary Sherman is a very respected. She was a trailblazing physician. Her murder remained one of the great unsolved cases of it when Ed Haslam took it over. And one of the reasons I at least give Ed Haslam the benefit of the doubt is he didn't come to this story as a conspiracy theorist. He came to the story as a journalist trying to figure out why was she killed, because it didn't make sense. And so a lot of what becomes the book Dr. Mary's Monkey, and the premise, which I'm sure most people here know, is the idea is that when the polio vaccine was being expanded and tested, it was grown on simian cells, and what that allowed was a viral form of cancer, and this came about, and they were trying to find a vaccine for this viral form of cancer, and the theory is that it would be, the CIA was trying to figure out a way to weaponize this. Ed knows and speaks to this theory, but the idea of Alton Ochsner being the person that was approached to try to find a vaccine on a legitimate medical reason makes perfect sense. He was one of the leading experts on cancer treatment in the United States. At the time, Ochsner Hospital was the MD Anderson of its time. It's still a major cancer hospital, but it was the place to go. They and Mayo and a couple other places in the United States. And the Tulane School of Tropical Health, where alternate Ochsner started, was one of the main research facilities on a university level for these kinds of cancer treatments. So Mary Sherman, who was taught at Tulane, who briefly, but who was a research doctor who has worked with, she being in the middle of this and the connections to all of this makes perfect sense. Was her death due to a cover up and all this? I don't think there's any way to know, but her as a prominent doctor and respected person dealing with, that makes perfect sense.
Which brings us to a figure controversial in our community, Judith Baker, whose story I investigated and talked to her one time and came away not satisfied. But you know her and you know the milieu. What do you make of Judith Baker's story?
I've been around Judith Baker probably extended amounts of time, at least a half a dozen multi-day, multi-things, interviewed her extensively. I never found contradictions in her story. So I'm an investigative journalist. I came up. I've spent a lot of time interviewing people, and it's easy to find flaws if you know how to look for it. And I didn't find active flaws. I found her. She's a lady who suffers from a low thyroid condition. She can be very physically, not mentally unbalanced, physically, like her hands shake, she's not in great health. And so she comes into telling this story, but other elements of what she describes in the story do make sense based on the way I've heard these people described by first person accounts. So I've always given her the benefit of the doubt. I mean, the one problem with the Judith Vary Baker story is, in order to believe it, you have to believe that Lee's marriage to his Russian wife, Mariana, was basically just a cover to get her in the United States. And there's enough evidence that that's not entirely true. It wasn't a happy marriage. I mean, and so there can be a degree of skepticism. I will say that I find her story interesting enough with everything else I know to at least say it's in the realm of possibility, because everyone she's describing and the way she's describing the elements and the events makes sense about everything else I know that was going on at this time. Mm-hmm. So it's not like she is gospel truth, but it's also that I remain undecided. I don't find her uncredible either. I just don't know.
Yeah. Thomas asked, do you know anything about, or have you heard anything about Marcello's connections to Joe Campisi in Dallas and Jack Ruby in Dallas?
Well, I'll tell you a story that's a firsthand account. So, a few years ago, I've been lecturing on the assassination and everything for several years, and a guy I'd been introduced to comes to. Besides our bookstore, we own a cafe next to it and serve breakfast. And he happened to be there, and I was walking through, and I'd met him before. And he said, "Christopher, hey, I got a story to tell you." And I knew the guy at this point well enough to know he's not some crazy loon. He was a regular patron, and we chatted several times. He says, He says, I hear you talk about the Kennedy assassination. Yeah. He says, well, I'll tell you that, I grew up in Jefferson Parish. He grew up near Bonneville Boulevard, which doesn't mean anything to anybody in this call, but it was at the time a relatively rural place right outside of New Orleans. And so they had a house and all this. You're not far outside the city, but you're just enough to where you're not maybe 10 minutes outside the parish line. And he said a red car was brought to us and told to put in our garage, and it was there, and we were never to talk about it. We were instructed, and it was brought in by a couple of Marcel family endorsers. And the story that his father later told him, it stayed there for a year, was that this is Jack Ruby's car. And it was brought there, and his father had done some work for Carlos Marcello, and it was brought in there. That's the only comment I can make about the relationships. If this story is valid, and I have no reason to disbelieve it, he wasn't trying to brag that he was close to it. He said this was a story, a weird thing, and we were threatened within an inch of our lives by my parents, and they never spoke about it except one time. It kind of gets the relationship. The other part is to understand how the commission worked, and the Mob Museum in Las Vegas does a wonderful job of explaining this. Essentially, Carlos Marcello's remit is the entire Gulf Coast. He is the commission. He is the commission member overseeing all of this. So it makes perfect sense that essentially everything goes through Marcello, if it's from Texas all the way to Florida, basically.
But that story suggests that Marcello and Ruby had a connection.
Very much so.
Yeah. One other person asks, because they have a personal connection, to another New Orleans character, Bill Gaudet. Does that name mean anything to you?
I've heard the name. I can't really comment well enough on it, but I've heard the name.
He was kind of like a print Ed Butler.
Yes.
He had an anti-communist newsletter, and he seemed to move on the fringes of the CIA world. He seemed to be informed about the CIA world if he wasn't actually part of the CIA.
He was kind of a pamphleteer, I guess is the best way of thinking about him. Not a conventional reporter at the sense, but around everything at the time. Yeah.
Right.
We would probably call him a blogger today.
Yeah. Okay. Well, a fascinating array of characters. A couple of people have had their hands up, so let's hear from them. Mark Bujos has a question.
Yes, my question is about the interview of Ed Butler with Oswald. Mm-hmm. The way I understand it, there was the interview, which is about 32 minutes long, and then later there was the debate. I think it was Ed Butler and Carlos Bringuer and I think William Stuckey. My question is about the interview. Do you know where that interview was recorded?
They went down Canal Street from where to the WGSO radio studios, which was right down the street. It was about,
so both were in the studios.
Yes. And so Ed Butler, the way there's a recreation of it in one of the video productions where they just use a still of Oswald and his words and Ed Butler talking, that makes it seem a little bit more dynamic than the way it probably was. As somebody who's a radio talk show host, they sat around a table that had a couple of boom mics, and they talked back and forth. It's not quite as sensational as Ed's recreation of it may have been. But
the recordings exist, though.
You can get it. You can get it on the test. I've got a record of it. One of the tragedies is that Ed had the original recordings of it. And he had this incredible archive of all this, stuff, original recordings of shows that went back decades, accumulated this incredible archive. I begged and pleaded with him to donate it to the Historic New Orleans Collection or Tulane University Howard Tilden Archive or a whole bunch of things. And he kept always wanting to see Ed didn't have a lot of money later in life, and he thought it was a good way to monetize it. And so he brought it out to his house in Bogalusa and put it in a shed. His house took about 7 feet of water in Hurricane Katrina. And of course, Ed died 1 week after Katrina of massive heart failure. And I've told his son Craig, I often, we got together and I said, I think Ed died of a broken heart because all of his life's work just washed away. And it was very tragic. It was we used to joke at WTIX it was Ed's junk, but it really was. These original recordings were. It wasn't just the Oswald recordings. It was decades of irreplaceable historical data that was just gone.
Wow.
So
Did you have a chance to talk to? Did you have a chance to talk to him much about the interview and the debate?
Oh yeah, at length, many times. Ed and I both are people who'd stick in the office till late, and I was running the marketing for the radio station at the time, and so we had a lot of late meetings. Ed actually never believed. Ed believed that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. He said Ed was very much about an agitation of communism overwhelming the logic of the human spirit. And Ed wrote a very compelling book about American political cycles called Revolution is My Profession, which is out of print. I have a copy of it, but it actually predicts a lot of elements that created Donald Trump's rise and so on and so forth. It's a pretty good political Ptolemaic. But when it came to Oswald, everybody came to him and said it's got to be a conspiracy. He didn't think that. He literally thought this was the agitation of one person. And I've had and people who then interviewed Ed separate from me, and I was just around the man for 2.5 years, day in and day out. But people who've interviewed like Ed Haslam and others basically kind of said, Ed's identity was so built on this that it was his whole career. It was the major story that launched him into having a national talk show. In the Square World of Ed Butler was a very highly rated show at in the mid to late end of the 1960s. It was too much for Ed to contemplate that he might have been wrong on this. Ed at times could be, for somebody who was actually a really brilliant thinker and a very innovative and thoughtful individual, when it came to the idea of he would be silenced, he could kind of go off the deep end. And one of my favorite stories is the radio station building backed up to a mall, and it had the Ticketmaster office right below Ed's office window. And in those days, this is 2000, 2001, people would line up for major concerts all night. And one time a brick went through Ed's window, and Ed was convinced it was a communist conspiracy to silence him. When it was obvious to everyone else at the station that it was just some stupid kid who threw a brick through the window. So Ed wanted bulletproof plexiglass put on all the windows. And we were like, at the time we couldn't make payroll, and he says, Tidmore, take care of it. Went, bulletproof plexiglass. I said, what? I mean, come on. So there was that side of Ed, just to be fair, So.
Yeah. Hey, Chad Nagel has a question. Chad is a staff writer for JFK Facts.
I am indeed. Thanks, Jeff. So my question is, first of all, it's a yes or no. Do you know very much about a fellow named Alfred J. Moran Sr., who was a guy who told the deputy chief of the local CIA office, a guy named Hunter Leak, and this is documented, this is not, this is actually in a CIA document, that Garrison had an ironclad case. He later retracted that. But the reason that I'm interested in this guy is that he was supposedly a wealthy and prominent New Orleans businessman who had a CIA code name. He was a CIA spotter in Miami and New Orleans at the time, and I believe at the time of the assassination, almost certainly. And according to the Mary, his name, Alfred J. Moran Sr., he almost certainly had the CIA cryptonym Amluff 1. And I'm just wondering, because I can't find much record. I finally found out from online after an extensive search that he probably died in 1996, and he was probably about 40 years old at the time of the assassination. I think he was probably very important. I thought initially that Mary Farrell Foundation was out of date by saying that he was probably the guy with the CIA cryptonym AMLUF1. But I later found out Mary Farrell Foundation was not out of date because it's not 100%. It's just so obvious that it's him. And he was a very important guy, and he was a kind of an informant for the local CIA office. And I'm just wondering if you know what happened to him. Apparently, he died in 1986. His son is dead. His widow is dead, according to online information. And he was born in Michigan, and I don't even know where he's buried. Do you know anything about this person?
I've heard the name, but to be honest with you, the answer is no. The players, I'm very careful to say that the people I'm talking about, when I talk about it, I'm talking about a first-hand account, and none of the people that I've talked about ever brought him up. They brought up other people that often don't make the story, but they never. While I've heard the name, it's never been part of the accounts that have been referred to me. Having said that, there were people going into that CIA office constantly. I mean, it was it was almost a line. There's sort of what used to be a road and is now, even at the time, was kind of a public park, and people used to line up downstairs. So it's entirely possible.
I think the main thing about Moran is that he was the guy that, remember, there was this thing about the New Orleans airport VIP lounge, and whether or not Clay Shaw was there. And I think, my head's a bit like a sieve these days, but Alfred J. Moran said that he saw, I think it was the name Clay Bertrand or Clem Bertrand on the VIP list. You had to sign a book. So when he went in, he saw that. And of course, later on, he just retracted everything. But that's basically the significance of that guy so far. But we still don't have all the information about him. So that's why I asked. But thank you. Anyway.
Well, I can't speak of that. I can speak about the Clay Bertrand alias with one story you may not have heard. Somebody I encourage Jeff to get on to chat with is the former head of the police union, is a man by the name of Irv Magrey. He's a very well-known figure in Louisiana politics. He's head of crime fighters. And Irv, for years, swore to a story and swears to it publicly. He, as head of the police union, he was very close. The cops would come to an appeals. He started Peno, and on his deathbed, a man by the name of Aloysius Havihorse, who had been a beat cop in the 8th District, which is the French Quarter, asked to see him. And Aloysius is like, I have to confess. And Irv said, I'm not a priest. I mean, what are you confessing to me? And he says, I got to confess that the night that Clay Shaw was arrested and brought in, he wrote Clay Bertrand on the thing. And I was told to get rid of the book, to get rid of the whole element. And I've never told the story on us. And Irv will tell you the story publicly. And Irv has a sterling reputation in politics. There's no reason he doesn't comment on the rest of these. He said, that's the only thing that I know. It's a firsthand account. And that's the only one I can say about the aliases. Was there a time where there's a connection with Clay Shaw and Bertrand? That's the only one I can comment on. So.
Very interesting. Cal Louise, you have your hand up, but you need to unmute so we can hear your question.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Beautiful. Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity. So, Christopher, your explanation of the political landscape of Nolens back in the 60s is really interesting. And I think it's important in the JFK story because I feel like it undermines the claim that Oswald was a genuine Marxist. And that's of interest to me because I am a Marxist socialist. And I've noticed over time through, my brief in and out research on the subject that there seems to be a lot of contradiction in the way that he discusses Marxism, discusses his views on it. And I don't get the impression that he's a genuine Marxist in the way that he discusses his political beliefs. So I guess I'm curious what your views on that are.
So I've listened to the Ed Butler recording dozens of times. And he comes across very, to me, just looking at it as a, I've spent a good bit of my career. I've managed 2 United States Senate campaigns and, done a lot. He reminds me of a lot of politicians I gave talking points to to be uttered back to people. And so, yeah, I have a certain skepticism because it doesn't seem natural. He says all the right things, quote unquote, at the right times, but it seems a little rehearsed.
Right.
A little bit.
That's
Yeah.
my sense as well.
There isn't an ease. My experience, most Marxist-Leninists have a philosophical view. There's sort of an academic kind of fallback of what they do. There's passion, but they approach it differently. I can't tell you for sure. I'm not a Marxist-Leninist, but I have watched this. I also know that there were left-wing groups in New Orleans that were very prominent at the time, and yeah, they didn't really know who Lee Oswald was.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Paul, Don has his hand up. You need to unmute, Don.
Oh, yes, sir. Thanks, Jeff. Chris, thanks for joining us. It's great to hear someone, that whatever, that's been around New Orleans and it's got some perspective from the old days. But so I'm going back to the old days, and so I believe you said your grandmother, your grandparents were familiar with Clay Shaw, maybe even your parents. And I want to be respectful when I ask this question because I'm not trying.
Go ahead, and not a problem.
Yeah. So Clay Shaw obviously was gay, and in those days, like if you were a prominent figure and you were gay, whatever, everyone kind of played along with the fact that, okay, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, was there any sense that your parents actually knew that he was a gay man and they just sort of played along with what was, in those times, they just kind of went along with it?
So it was my grandmother who knew him, and my grandmother had a couple of friends who, in the parlance of the time, would have been confirmed bachelors. Is how it was referred to, and you didn't talk about it. I always refer to Tennessee Williams' story, where he was at an event and he was invited to a carnival ball, and he meets all of these young debutantes, and they say he invites them to come to his apartment in the French Quarter, which was very off limits to a properly raised young lady from uptown. And so they all go, and they know that he has this friend, and they go into the apartment. They go in, they see one bedroom. They're looking for the other person's bedroom, that's his roommate, and they can't contemplate in their heads, why is there just one bed? And these were young women at 20 years old, 21 years old. So it literally was never talked about. The reason I explain that, it existed. People knew it. There was a wink and a nod, but it was not like, hey, we know privately gay. It was not uttered. It was not spoken of. It was not referred to. If anything had really ever come out in public, it would have been, but as long as it's not in public, and this is one of the things about New Orleans, as long as it was just kept below the surface, as a society, we didn't ask. We've all, from our beginnings, but certainly well into the 20th century, New Orleans was the one place in the South, one of the few places in the country that had a very active gay subculture, but it was make no mistake, it was not speaking, heard, or this, certainly for not someone in society. It happens all the time. I knew plenty of people growing up where, you didn't, some of them had beards, we'd call them today, marriages that were marriages in name only. Some of them had kids, could do that, but had very active gay lifestyles. They were figures in my life. I had no idea. And it wasn't until after they were dead or years later that my father said, yeah, it was kind of known, but it was never talked about. My father's club, the Bienville Club, was just across the street, like a block and a half from the Pickwick Club. And I remember one of his friends, And I didn't realize until years later that he was gay. And so that kind of gives you an idea. And it wasn't because I was vague. It was so not addressed. And there was no, what we think of as the sort of telltale physical or speech signs. Clay Shaw was not that at all. He would have been, to use a very politically incorrect term, passing very much. And you wouldn't have known.
Paul
Yeah.
Kowalski has a question.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear
Yeah.
you.
Great. So what's your three hurricane theory of the crime? And before you answer, let me just say that there's those who think the official version and not, and those who don't, I'll give you lots of leeway and permission to describe if you're in that category, however you do.
I've spent 30 years trying to answer this question. Could a sniper make that shot? Yes. Is it scientifically possible that the Spectre resolution was what happened? Sure. Is it logical that the other stuff that I know, the car incident, other things that I know about what was going on at the same time, even the assassination of Lee Oswald by Jack Ruby, can all of those things happen and you not question that there's a lot more going on than we know? It stresses incredulity in my mind. I mean, there is enough evidence in my head that there was more to this than we will probably ever know. One of the things I do is I produce, besides my radio show and stuff, I produce a podcast of Hunter S. Thompson stories. And my co-host on them, Curtis Robinson, was Hunter's editor and his best friend. And I'm actually throwing an event, if you're a Hunter Thompson fan, in the third week of May about Hunter. And I remember a story that was one night at Owl Farm in Colorado. It's 2:00 in the morning, and the group of them, and Curtis is one of the people there, are arguing what day of the week the Kennedy assassination was on. And they knew what the date was, but was it a Tuesday or a Wednesday? They're trying to figure it out. And this is, pre-internet. You couldn't just Google it. So at 2:00 in the morning, Hunter takes it upon himself to call John. Remember, Hunter's writing for George Magazine at the time. Calls him at home, wakes him up. It's 4 a.m. in New York. And he says the following statement. Says, John, when the mob killed your father, do you remember what day of the week it was? John didn't argue with that point. He said, yeah, I think it was a Wednesday. And said to Hunter, John Kennedy thought his father was murdered by the mob. That's how I answer that question.
Great story. It was on the night of November 22nd, 1963, that Hunter Thompson coined the term fear and loathing in a letter to his friend, the novelist William Kennedy.
Yes.
Which I always thought was a remarkable historical occasion. We've been talking for an hour, 10 minutes. Dan Storper has his hand up, which is appropriate because it was Dan who introduced me to Christopher. So Dan is responsible for this whole show. So we might as well wrap it up with Dan's question.
Hey, Chris, how are you?
Good, Dan. Thank you so much for putting us in contact, by the way. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm glad it worked out. It really
great.
Last minute. Two things that I just wanted to point out, kind of going back to things you said earlier. Shep Morrison, in addition to being the ambassador to the OAS for Kennedy, was also mayor of New Orleans, and he died in this mysterious plane crash in 1964, a piloted plane by Hugh Ward, who was one of Bannister's pilots and a friend of Lee Harvey Oswald. So as Garrison said, there was a really interesting transcript of a meeting that he had with several researchers that he was working with who were coming down. He said, well, there goes another part of the Bannister organization. So basically, Bannister dies in 64. most people believe he was killed. The people that I know that know inside stories, and then basically Shep Morrison, who knew a lot, was a friend of Kennedy's, and Hugh Ward, who was the pilot for Bannister and Shep Morrison, they die in a plane crash in Mexico. And then one other thing about what Irv Magri said, Aloysius Hagedorn actually did say in court that Clay, that he did get the get from Clay Shaw, that he was asked, or Clay Shaw, he asked Clay Shaw, do you have an alibi? What do you call it? An alias. And he said, yes, Clay Bertrand. So basically the understanding was it was a clear-cut case of him admitting, and apparently Garrison said, I've never had that happen to me in my entire career, where somebody basically tells a policeman when he's being booked that he has an alias, and not being Ed Haggerty, the judge, was not permitting that to be acceptable in court. And then I have this lawyer friend who's now about 90, and he was at a party with Ed Haggerty that week, and Haggerty got drunk, and he said something shortly after, he basically wouldn't accept that Clay Shaw as Clay Bertrand alias. He said, if Garrison thinks he's going to get a conviction of Clay Shaw, he must be out of his mind.
Clay Shaw was, none of the, I don't think anybody here on the call is from New Orleans. The comparison I use for Clay Shaw today as a level of respect is, and figures New Orleans would be a guy by the name of Ron Foreman, who's head of the Audubon Institute, man who saved the Audubon Zoo, created the park system, is, a friend of every business leader, is a friend of this. He had that kind of role. It was so inconceivable that this could happen, that people very actively ignored a lot that was going on. That's the base point I put to it. So
yeah.
It's the final look at all this is we may never know what happened. We do know this: these people were losing billions of dollars. They felt very much betrayed. Remember, Catholic City, John Kennedy has overwhelming support, and a lot of things don't make sense when all the events happen. I'd also add, by the way, Chet Morrison dies. Who dies a year and a half, 2 years later? Is Hale Boggs, under a call. And Hale Boggs lived in the Garden District. He lives 2 blocks away. That's where Cokie Roberts, his daughter, and Lindy. I knew Lindy Boggs very well. And there was always questions about what happened. I mean, this, and Hale Boggs had questions. Hale Boggs is elected on the same reformist platforms, basically, that elect Chet Morrison and Jim Garrison. They're all kind of the new generation. They're all friends.
Yeah. Well, this brings up an interesting point. I don't know if you know the name Neil Gallagher. Cornelius Gallagher was a congressman. And Hale Boggs was telling people, including Gallagher, who was a friend of his in Congress, that, the Warren Commission was bullshit. And basically arranged, when Garrison was starting his investigation, Garrison came to DC and had a private lunch with Neil Gallagher and with Hale Boggs, basically to go over his case. Because I think behind the scenes, the thing that got Garrison really started on the case was Hale Boggs. I know he said that it was Russell Long, and Russell Long may have helped him along to get into it, because he did not believe that it was possible that Oswald got off that shot. But basically, it was my understanding from people that knew Garrison and knew the story, was that it was Hale Boggs, basically his unhappiness with the Warren Commission and generally feeling like there needed to be some serious re-looking at it. Plus, he was criticizing J. Edgar Hoover, and that was a big part of the suspicion about his death. His death, I think, was in 72 or 73, and it was right about the time of Watergate, and there was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. So there potential other reasons for it. But certainly Boggs was a big critic of the Warren Commission privately.
And Boggs was would have been, when McCormick left, he would have been the next Speaker of the House. And
Right.
so it is a constitutional role when all of this is happening. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. We've been talking for 75 minutes now, so I think it's time to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Christopher. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. A fascinating session. Like I said,
Thank
I learned
you.
a lot on the tour. I learned a lot more even tonight. So thank you, Christopher, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you all. Appreciate it,
We'll be
guys.
available online shortly. So look forward on JFK Facts.
Good night.
Good night.
Everybody.